there's another rebel offensive by more or less the same groups, also led by this group Tahrir al-Sham or HDS, further southwest from the Idlib province, which they ruled for a long time, toward the city of Hama. And Hama is another big city, not as big as Aleppo, but an important city nonetheless, more in central Syria. And once you get to Hama, you start getting into the areas that are really core areas of the regime, of Assad's regime. And these areas are really important to the regime. So the fact that the rebels have now, in just the space of just a few days, pushed to basically the outskirts of Hama for the first time, that's something that's really worrying for the regime, I think.
Let's turn our attention to what's happening in Syria, where rebel insurgents fighting President Assad's forces have launched attacks in the central province of Hama after taking the city of Aleppo in a surprise attack over several days. Iran, Assad's most significant backer, has said it will consider sending troops to Syria if requested by Damascus. Well, Aron Lund is a Syria and Middle East security expert at the Swedish Defence Research Agency and joins us now. Good evening to you, Aron.
Good evening.
We're hearing on the front page of one of the newspapers here in the UK tonight, Aleppo's residents wait in fear for Assad reprisal, and it seemed as though those rebel forces that seized Aleppo slightly took President Assad's regime by surprise. What's your understanding of the position in Syria now?
Well, I mean, it changes hour by hour. It's very difficult to say anything for certain because the information coming out of Syria is basically all propaganda from one side or the other, and you try to verify this as well as you can by looking at pictures and videos and comparing to satellite photos and so on. But the situation right now seems to be that the rebels still hold Aleppo, all of it, even though Assad's forces seem to have made some sort of a counteroffensive just south of the city. But then there's another rebel offensive by more or less the same groups, also led by this group Tahrir al-Sham or HDS, further southwest from the Idlib province, which they ruled for a long time, toward the city of Hama. And Hama is another big city, not as big as Aleppo, but an important city nonetheless, more in central Syria. And once you get to Hama, you start getting into the areas that are really core areas of the regime, of Assad's regime, and these areas are really important to the regime. So the fact that the rebels have now, in just the space of just a few days, pushed to basically the outskirts of Hama for the first time, that's something that's really worrying for the regime, I think, and that comes after losing Aleppo, which was the key, the main city of northern Syria.
President Assad has support from Iran. He also has support from Russia, and we've seen Russian airstrikes already. I mean, what do you think is going to be the extent of further foreign involvement in this conflict? We've had this long civil war in Syria. Many thought that it was more or less over, but it now does look as though there's huge instability.
Yes, and I think for both Russia and Iran, this is really serious, and they're really concerned at this situation. But they're also constrained in different ways. Russia, of course, is busy in Ukraine, has most or nearly all of its military tied up there. May find it difficult to send reinforcements to Syria, even though I should say the Syrian war is so much smaller in scale that even limited reinforcements might make a difference. But then you have Iran, which has been, supports Hezbollah in Lebanon, used Hezbollah in Syria during the civil war. And now, of course, Hezbollah is tied up in Lebanon, trying to guard against Israel there. There's a very shaky ceasefire. And the group has taken a lot of damage during that war, may not be able to help out in Syria, and Iran itself and its other regional allies that is used in Syria. They don't have the same freedom of action either, because they've been bombed by Israel in Syria for a long time, really, but especially intensively during the Lebanese war. So I think we heard the Iranian foreign minister say now that they will take into consideration any Syrian request to send troops. And of course, Iran has a big army, Revolutionary Guards, lots of forces that could come to Syria. But the question is, will they be able to get there? And once they show up, will they just be bombed by Israel? So it's unclear, actually. I don't think the regime is.
And it's a very complex situation, isn't it? I mean, I remember when David Cameron was the British Prime Minister at the height of the Civil War, openly declaring Assad must go, he must stand down. But now it seems that for countries like the UK, the United States, they're looking at these rebel forces and the involvement of groups with links to Islamic extremists, to Al Qaeda, and they don't seem to know which side to back.
Yeah, I think that is the case. They don't back either side, and I think U.S. policy, UK policy, European policy more generally has been fairly, there's not much of it. There's been some statements saying that we need a political transition and everyone should be nice, and it doesn't really matter. It's not relevant to what's going on in Syria. If they don't back either side, it doesn't matter. You have Turkey, for example, which does back the rebels, even though I think the Turks are a bit spooked by how far they've come and how much damage they've done to Assad because they weren't ready for this. But Turkey, for example, does play a meaningful role in Syria, for good or bad. Same with Russia, same with Iran, of course. And so, but there's not really of course, the United States has influence through by backing these Kurdish factions further northeast in Syria, but that's not really central to the conflict right now.
Let me just ask you about the other and one other aspect of the very complex picture across the Middle East, which I know you follow very closely. We saw this upsurge in fighting between Israel and Hezbollah, the Israeli forces carrying out strikes on Hezbollah targets inside Lebanon. They said that this was a response to some attacks by Hezbollah. Do you think that this is putting at risk what is supposed to be a ceasefire between the two?
I think so. I mean, I think both parties, for very different reasons, wanted the ceasefire. They may have wanted it with, more or less, um, but what's happened since the ceasefire was concluded is that you've seen continued tension along the border. You've seen especially Israeli strikes into Lebanon, saying that Hezbollah is cheating, Hezbollah is not doing what they should. And there was a part of the ceasefire agreement that set up a kind of a commission to investigate matters like that, complaints. But it's not really up and running yet, I think, or at least it doesn't seem to be effective. So what happened the other day was that Hezbollah, for the first time since the ceasefire, basically fired at Israel and said, this is a warning shot, stop attacking us or we'll start attacking you again. And Israel responded to that, killing 11 people. And now, where is this going to go? But I think if the United States and France and others who've been involved in setting up this ceasefire wanted to last, they'll have to engage more with the parties, I think.
Aron Lund, Syria and Middle East security expert at the Swedish Defence Research Agency. Really good to speak to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening.